Hi, this week I'm going to share with you some research that I did beginning as an undergraduate that led to several conference papers and publication in various journals, which I think that you might find of interest. Let me get my PowerPoint going here and share that screen with you. All right, let's begin. This is about the secret life of Albert Bigelow Paine. And Albert Bigelow Paine is best known as Mark Twain's official biographer and literary executor. And he has a strong Kansas connection, as you will see. The research that I did on Paine originally began when I was an as a graduate student, and I was taking a course in Mark Twain by Gary Bleecker. And during this course, I and the other students were assigned to do a research paper. And I did not know what my paper was going to be about. And one day, while sitting in a bookstore with my friend Gene DeGruson, who was the special collections librarian at Axe Library at Pitt State, I was describing to him, talking over ideas for this research paper, and then he said, I have some papers that you might want to take a look at. They are papers that I gathered from a junk shop, his words, in Fort Scott not long ago, and didn't really know what to make of them. I recognized Albert Bigelow Paine's name on them, and I vaguely knew that he was a children's book author and had some association with Mark Twain, but I went ahead and bought all the papers that they had, thinking they might be important. And indeed, Gene's instincts were correct, because what Gene had purchased was a divorce case involving Albert Bigelow Paine that was previously unknown and contradicts the story that had often been told of Paine's, the way Paine came to meet Mark Twain and become his official biographer, how Paine left Kansas. And here is the Heritage of the Great Plains. This is from 2016, and in it I recount the story of talking to Gene and getting the papers and then discovering this literary mystery story. And this is from 2016. This is the new territory. You have a PDF of this uploaded. Now, it is a galley, which means it's an uncorrected proof. There may be some typos, but it's essentially the story that ran in the New Territory, which is a journal of the Lower Midwest that was published in 2016. And here's the poster for the International Twain Conference at Elmira, New York in 2017, in which I presented a longer version of the research that I'm going to discuss with you now. Let's talk about some of the people involved in this. Of course, Mark Twain was born Samuel Clemens, 1835. And in 1906, when Paine met Clemens, he was 70 years old, and it was the occasion of Twain's 70th birthday party, which actually there was a series of parties in New York. Paine may have been at probably a couple of them, including one at the Players Club in New York. But here's the story that official biographers for Mark Twain, that the official biographer, Albert Bigelow Paine, told about himself and about, and that was adopted by other biographers as the years went on, and that is that Albert Bigelow Paine left Fort Scott, Kansas, after a failed marriage, married a woman by the name of Dora Losi, and they had children, and Paine met Clemens at the 70th birthday party and became his official biographer, confidant, and eventually literary executor. Paine was 44 in 1906. He came from Illinois. He learned photography. He had ambitions to be a writer, a poet, and a painter. May have traveled around the South doing some itinerant photography, tramping around and so forth. But by the 1880s, he ends up in Fort Scott, Kansas, and he marries Minnie Schultz, who is the daughter of a prominent Fort Scott businessman. And the father-in-law puts Paine up in his own business, that is the Paine Photographic Supply Company. Paine still has ambitions to write, and so he continues his literary endeavors on a regional level. He was, for example, a founder of the Kansas Authors Club, which still exists in the state, and was friends for a while with William Allen White, and even contributed some poems to a book of poetry that they had published together. Louise Payne is Albert Bigelow Paine's daughter, the daughter of Albert and Dora Losi, the eldest daughter. She was probably born, about 1894. And the reason we don't know exactly, I'll get to that. Well, I think we do know exactly, but this becomes part of the mystery as well. She was age 12 in 1906. And her age is important because Louise Payne was a founding member of Twain's Aquarium Club. And the Aquarium Club was Twain's collection of adolescent girls that met at his last home, Stormfield, at Redding, Connecticut. And he gave each of the girls an angelfish pin that identified them as members of the group. And if this sounds a little creepy to you, well, it is. This is something that Twain scholars have debated for years. Was there anything of a sexual nature with Twain and his Aquarium Club? Many scholars say no. Some scholars say, well, maybe. And the parents of at least one of the Aquarium Club members were unhappy with Twain's familiarity with one of the girls. There's no evidence that Twain molested or assaulted them in any way. It just, it does seem kind of creepy. And this was in 1906 when Albert and Mark Twain met. Twain's wife, Livy, had already died. His children were grown, and so he was on his own in New York, living in an apartment house, and then later he bought the house at Redding, Connecticut, that he called Stormfield, or had the house built, I should say. And here's a photo of Mark Twain with Louise Payne playing billiards at Stormfield. And the photo was taken by Louise's father, Albert Bigelow Paine. It's been reproduced many times. Often Louise is not identified in this photo. And on the wall behind Twain, you can see an angelfish. Actually, there are angelfish and pictures of young women all around the walls of the billiard room. So this became the unofficial headquarters for the Aquarium Club, was Twain's billiard room. There we have a picture of Twain as a young man. There on the left from about 1901, and there on the right in the bowler hat is Paine, and he's with his friend William Allen White. They were both in journalism in Kansas in the late 1880s and early 1890s. And as I said, they published a book of poems together. They paid to have this printed at a Fort Scott printer, and each was supposed to receive the same number of copies. Well, the friendship ended when Albert Bigelow Paine took all 200 copies of the book that was to be printed, and he sent White's copies out as review copies. So that pretty much ended the friendship there. Here is Paine's Photographic Supply Store, the building that Minnie Schultz's father bankrolled for Albert in the 1880s. And Dora Losey, remember, Dora is Louise's mother. Well, Albert Bigelow Paine met Dora Losey in Fort Scott during this time. And Dora was an assistant at Paine's dentist's office. Paine complained of trouble with his teeth for his entire life, and apparently visited a lot of dentists, but at his dentist's office, which was just a few blocks from the Photographic Supply Store, is where he met Dora Losey, who was a young woman from just across the line over in Missouri. Was in her early 20s. And here's a photo of the Schultz Paine building. As it looked in 2016, it doesn't look too different than it does here. It's abandoned just before I took this photo, like just a few months before there had been a fire. The building had been divided into 6 apartments. There were people living there. There had been a fire. It damaged the upstairs floor. The building was unsafe to occupy. So it has remained unoccupied since at least 2016, probably 2015. But it's a very distinctive building, and of course it has the Schultz Paine name above the door. And on the other side of the building, there's a ghost of a sign painted on it that says Paine Photographic Supply Company. That's all but faded away. Building's still there. It's not too far. You can actually see it from the bypass in Fort Scott. If you look toward it's a few blocks south of the downtown area, but it's pretty easy to find. Here's a photo of my friend Jean DeGruson, who I described talking with in the bookstore, and he told me he had these papers. And here is an example. This is the first page of the divorce petition. And in this petition, and what happened is that apparently the Bourbon County District Court had thrown out a number of court cases that were considered to be of no significance. And one of these was this court case, which was apparently unknown to scholars. Not apparently, it was unknown to scholars. And Gene was just smart enough to recognize the name and gather up as many of the pages as he could. And we have all the pages except for one, I believe. And in this petition, Albert's wife, Minnie, is alleging that Albert has abandoned her, that he absconded from Fort Scott and went to New York with a woman unknown, and declared that he no longer wanted to be with Minnie. There was no resolution to this divorce. It was not settled until Minnie's death. We'll get to that. But this was something that was reported in the papers at the time. And when I went back and looked through the clippings of the papers, I was surprised that the Kansas papers covered this divorce trial so intensely. Not a trial yet, but the divorce case. so intensely, and not a word of it had gotten into the Twain scholarship. And why is this important? Well, it became the thesis for that graduate paper that I wrote so many years ago, and it's continued to be the thesis of the work going forward. And it's this: should we trust a biographer who lies about his own life? At the time that I wrote the paper, there were many unanswered questions. Because Paine apparently made up a date for his marriage to Dora Losi of 1892, that would, or she perhaps made it up. There are various dates, but 1892 seems to be the most one. This suggested that Paine, at worst, was a bigamist during this time period. I don't believe that Paine and Dora were actually married. And many years after I wrote that first graduate paper, I discovered the answer to most of the questions I had. That Louise Payne went on to become an editor at a women's magazine in New York. And during World War II in 1943, she was assigned to go across the country for a journalistic assignment. And she decided to pause in Kansas City and to visit Dr. and Mrs. Costin. And Dr. Costin was Albert Bigelow Paine's dentist in Fort Scott. And here she is writing a letter to her sisters, Franny and Joy, about the family story, because it was their origins were a mystery to themselves as well. And the way that I found this letter, and this it took quite a bit of work, but let me see how I can explain this succinctly and the best. That Stephen Bigelow, Albert Bigelow Paine's great-grandson, who is a professor at the University of Virginia, I wrote a letter to him. It was long about 2013, 2014, and explained what I was working on. And I said, hey, do you have any idea whether Dora and Albert were actually married, and do you have any proof of it? I explained that the research I had done and what I'd come to believe. And the research at that point had included birth certificates, which we'll see those in a minute, for the 3 Paine children. Actually 4. One died as an infant. But, birth certificates for everyone except Louise, who was probably born in St. Louis. But for the 3 that were born in New York, I found those with the help of my wife, Kim, who's an excellent researcher, and wrote letters to the Bureau of Statistics in New York and got the birth certificates. We'll see scans of those. And then when I wrote Stephen about this, the reply was almost immediate. He said that he had been waiting for years for someone to ask him this question. And that his father, who had also been a writer and a professor, had once set out to do, and this was in the 1970s, once set out to do a biography of Albert Bigelow Paine, and collected all the information he could, and then gave up on it because what he found was too troubling and contradicted the family story. And so when Stephen's dad died, his papers were bundled up and were sold to the Bancroft Library in California, and where they had lain uncatalogued and unindexed for many, many years. He died in early 2000s, and so this letter was among the reams and reams of paper that Stephen's dad had collected. Stephen said he thought that there was a letter that Louise had written to the sisters, that he'd seen it when he was a kid, that he hadn't seen it since. It might be in this collection, and Bob Hurst, the general editor of the Mark Twain Project at the Bancroft Library, has access to this. And so I entered into a long email exchange with Bob Hurst, telling him what I was looking for, and met no success at first. Was told that these papers were not indexed yet. They had not yet been cataloged. They were still in the original boxes, and I kept asking. And then eventually I made arrangements to visit. And when Bob Hurst knew I was going to come out and asked to look at them myself, then he finally went through them. And he actually was not obstructionist. He had had an accident and hurt his shoulder, and so it took some, actually months to find this letter after Stephen had mentioned it. But he found it and sent me copies of it, and the letter was just, well, it was brilliant. And here's the beginning of it. I'm making this a joint letter because it may be fairly long, because I want you both to have all the news in it. Also, I want to keep a carbon of the family story for myself. My typewriter is having a touch of war jitters, so overlook the slips. And Louise used her journalistic skill to interview Dr. and Mrs. Costin, who were aged at the time, but remembered Albert quite well, and remembered Dora quite well, and so Louise put all that the Costins had to share. And as you can see on this, at the end of this, bottom of this page, Daddy as a young man was a kind of troubadour, Dr. Costin's own words. He could paint a bit, sing pleasantly, accompany himself on the guitar, not only write poetry, but quote it by the hour. I never knew anybody who could recite so many things by heart. His height and rather poetic looks fitted the turn of the century ideal perfectly. His only drawback was his stammering, which seems to have been worse than at any later time. A curious note is that he laughed at this impediment as much as anyone in those days, although you both remember that in our childhood it was never even mentioned. So, Albert Bigelow Paine was a stutterer, and apparently quite a bad stutterer in Fort Scott. It seemed to get better as time went on. And this is the part where it mentions Dora. Then Mother, Dora, came to work for Dr. Costin. She, whom we knew as being so unworldly, so self-conscious with strangers, had spunk enough 50 years ago to go out and get herself a job. Dora was a pretty little thing with her dark hair and blue eyes. She was a good worker, too. She was rather quiet, never very talkative, although she laughed at things that came up and liked a joke, too. Daddy came in to have some of his perpetual dental work done and was completely bowled over. I suppose he was a misunderstood husband and just ripe for romance. Anyhow, he proceeded to sweep her off her feet. She told Mrs. Costin years later, I couldn't any more have resisted him than a little fish can resist a great octopus. Soon it was evident that Daddy was spending far more time in the dental office than his teeth warranted. And of course, as things progressed, Dora became with child, and at some point, in the early 1890s, Albert Bigelow Paine left Fort Scott, abandoned Minnie, and took Dora with him east. Apparently, he installed her in St. Louis, where Louise was born, and then later brought her with him to New York, where he was working he worked for a couple of different magazines as editor. He was writing short stories. He started writing novels. And most importantly, he'd started writing biographies. And one of his biographies was of the famous Texas Ranger. And this got him enough notoriety to get him invited to Mark Twain's 70th birthday parties in 1906. And during this time, Albert Bigelow Paine is writing novels that are only slightly fictionalized versions of his own experiences. He's obsessed with cheating spouses, deceit. He writes many stories in which the lovers die horrible deaths or discovered and held up to public ridicule. He also describes, in a book called The Van Dwellers, his challenge of finding lodging for himself and Dora and Louise early on in New York, and then later moving again when the other girls came. And here's a passport for Dora Losi. And this is the kind of research that I find particularly fascinating, this archival research that adds to the story. As I said, Kim is very good at this. With my background as being an investigative reporter, I'm no slouch either. And so what we did is triangulate all these things. And in this passport, even though many sources give the date of their marriage as 1892, here Dora on her passport application lists it as August 2nd, 1893 in St. Louis. And lists the year of Louise's birth as 1894. And I list several other sources that give 1892. Now, the city directories of New York for 1898 and 1899 have Albert Kirby, journalist, living at 606 East 156th. And that's interesting. Well, and it is undoubtedly Albert Bigelow Paine, but Kirby was Paine's mother's maiden name. It also lists Albert Paine, author, at 127 Fifth Avenue, which is the editorial offices of one of the magazines that he edited, Youth and Home. They are not separate individuals. They are the same individual. There are birth certificates, for example, for a Dora Kirby, the child born in 1898, which triangulates these addresses for us as reported by Dr. Ray, the physician. This child was later renamed Frances or Franny. But notice Dora Kirby, I just thought that, taking Dora's name and Albert's mother's maiden name, he left a pretty broad trail in the public record for anyone to figure out what actually was going on. And it stood for, 100 years. In 1944, Frances obtained a delayed certificate of birth because she needed her birth certificate to go to work for a government job, and she couldn't find it under her own name in New York. So she applied and got a whole new birth certificate issued to her. And so she's a woman with two birth certificates, two different names, and both certificates were obtained by me from the Municipal Archives of the City of New York in 2015, helping to solve some of the mystery. Here's Franny's original birth certificate as Dora Kirby in 1898, and then her delayed certificate in 1944. And here is a picture of Franny when she was working for the State Department. This is a visa. I just like this because I like the picture of her. She looks so stern. And here's some clippings from Kansas papers, and I believe these are both from the Fort Scott paper. And these were published in the 1890s. A little while ago, a sketch of Albert Bigelow Paine, the young Fort Scott poet, appeared in which it was stated in the usual style that Mrs. Payne was Albert's inspiration and that their home life was a paradise. The grounds given by Mrs. Payne in her suit for divorce are adultery, and that her husband is ashamed to introduce her into the society of his swell friends in New York. And then there were several trips. This is one speculating on whether there might be a reconciliation when Minnie, after having filed suit against Albert, had gone to New York to try a reconciliation, although it was not to be. Here's a rather cutting piece. And Ollie Royce was a writer for the Pittsburgh, Kansas Dispatch, a paper that is no longer with us. And rather cutting toward Albert. Kansans did not have much admiration for Paine following the news of the divorce case. And then finally, Minnie dies of cancer, having not resolved the divorce case, and of course the divorce case dies with her. And then Albert came back to Fort Scott and originally asked for half of the business that he had abandoned, but under public pressure signed everything over to, I believe it was Minnie's sister. And this was in 1901 or 1902. And this is the Quarry Farm outside of Elmira, New York, which I visited during the conference in 2017, where I gave the presentation. And this is where the location where Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn. Well, not the exact location. This is the house, but he worked at a gazebo just outside the house. And here I am standing at the place where the gazebo once stood. So I'm holding a glass of spirits from the after party from the conference, and standing at the place where Mark Twain wrote Huckleberry Finn, which was it was surreal. I have kind of a funny look on my face, I guess, because I'm thinking about the magnitude of that. The gazebo was not torn down, by the way. It was moved. The gazebo is now on the grounds of Elmira College, and you can see it if you visit the campus. It has been restored and put back in the kind of shape that Twain would have been accustomed to. It's got a little fireplace. It's not very big. It would be a charming place to write. And there it is. And the farm was owned by an in-law of Twain's, but he liked going there and writing. And so Huckleberry Finn was written in that very gazebo, published in 1884. And there is Mark Twain's grave in Elmira. Died April 21st, 1910. Albert Bigelow Paine lived until 1937, I think, or 1937. And he becomes more and more important because what happened is that, or more and more important to Twain scholarship, because after Twain and Albert Bigelow Paine began working on the biography together, they became friends. And when Twain built his home, Stormfield, at Redding, Connecticut, Albert Bigelow Paine bought a house just down the hill from it and moved the family in. So the family of Albert and Dora and Joy and Franny and Louise, of course, were living just down the hill from Mark Twain. This is why we have so many pictures of the Paine children, particularly Louise, with Mark Twain. Mark Twain also designated Albert Bigelow Paine as his literary executor, along with one of his daughters, but one of Twain's daughters. But Albert Bigelow Paine certainly held the control for this, and for many years, from Twain's death to Paine's death, he controlled the Twain estate and guarded Twain's relationship jealously. Put out, and I'm not exaggerating, there's probably dozens of authorized biographies of one sort or another of Mark Twain. There's, for example, a Boy's biography. There's the Fuller biography. Mark Twain, of course, famously said that his complete autobiography, should not be published until after his death. That has since been published by the Bancroft Library in 3 rather thick volumes. Unfortunately, there's not a lot that is brand new there. Most of it has already been looked at by scholars in one way or another. One of the things that Albert Bigelow Paine did as literary executor was to rewrite some of the things that Twain had left and to hide other things that he thought would be too strong for the public to take. He is most famous for clipping and pasting 3 different manuscripts to come up with one whole manuscript of the Mysterious Stranger. And this is one of the reasons why The Mysterious Stranger is not a completely coherent work. And not only did he smush things together to create this work, he apparently wrote, well, not apparently, he did write connecting passages, etc., and change the ending to a different way. So this is something that we would expect a literary biographer, a literary executor, an official biographer not to do today. Biography was in its infancy in the early 20th century. It had really only started to be recognized as a discipline in about 1890. But again, with Albert Bigelow Paine's lying about his own life, I don't suppose that it is surprising that he would not shy away from actually writing things and jamming things together and presenting them as Mark Twain's own work, when in fact they were not. It was interesting describing these findings to the scholarly group at Elmira. And the way that I got invited to Elmira is that I published these couple things before. I presented at Samlin a presentation on this, about the secret life of Albert Bigelow Paine. And there were a couple of people who were well-known Twain scholars, and then they urged me to offer a presentation for the coming Mark Twain International Conference, which is held only every 4 years. And I did, and was accepted, and so I delivered this before a plenary session. And I had some people argue with me about my conclusions, about whether Paine was trustworthy or not, because there was still this attitude that Albert Bigelow Paine was responsible for giving us mostly what we know about Mark Twain. And I think that's true. But I think that he gave us an incomplete version at best, and perhaps a sanitized version. The Aquarium Club seems to have been formed with Albert Bigelow Paine's blessing, since Louise was a founding member. It seems a little disturbing. And I just have never trusted Albert Bigelow Paine since I discovered the difference between the official story and what really went on. And Twain scholars, there is a cottage industry in Twain scholarship. When you talk about literary scholarship, Mark Twain occupies an enormous amount of territory in the landscape of American literature. And when you start shaking those foundations, then reactions can get pretty heated. The last time it happened was, about a generation ago, when one or two scholars began questioning whether The Mysterious Stranger was actually Twain's work or whether it was Paine's work. And they proved pretty conclusively, looking at the original galleys, etc., that much of it was Albert Bigelow Paine's handiwork. And so the scholarship continues. So I feel good to be able to have contributed to what is known about Mark Twain and his life and his relationship with Albert Bigelow Paine, and where Albert Bigelow Paine came from, because he's an important figure in Kansas literature. I don't mind the controversy. This is one of the things, when you present a paper at a conference like this, you are expected to be able to defend it. And there was just so much research that I had that I could support every factual item that I presented. Of course, my conclusion, my question: can you trust a biographer who lies about his own life? Well, the jury is still out on that, because there's still a few things that we need to know. Complicating this is that Albert Bigelow Paine was fairly secretive. All of the Twain papers he guarded pretty jealously. He had them literally in a safe. Bernard DeVoto, the noted scholar, was supposed to, who took Paine's place as literary executor for a while. Same position, by the way, that Bob Hearst occupies. Got into many early arguments with Paine over access to the archives. And one of the things that Albert Bigelow Paine said to Bernard DeVoto, who we know now mostly through his book, Across the Wide Missouri, but what Albert Bigelow Paine said in a letter to DeVoto when DeVoto was asking to see the manuscript material was this: everything that needs to be known about Mark Twain has already been said. And this was in the 1930s. And of course, we know that that just is not true. I expect that there will be more letters forthcoming. The Bancroft Library still has not gone through and cataloged the collection from Stephen's dad yet. So I don't think that there is anything, there may not be anything of as significance as Louise's 1943 letter to her sisters. But there could be other, supporting information. It will be interesting to see how that turns out. I've gone back and forth about doing a biography of Mark Twain, of Albert Bigelow Paine. And here's my problem. I do not like Albert Bigelow Paine. I don't think you should necessarily like the subject of your biography, but you see this a lot, that biographers often fall in love with their subjects. Saw this with Carlos Baker and his biography of Ernest Hemingway, for example. But it's not just that I feel very uneasy with Paine, and I don't think I have enough information quite yet. Paine is a fascinating character. I like Louise Payne very much. You think about where she must have come from in terms of psychologically, having been a founding member of the Aquarium Club, having a 70-year-old, the world's most famous man, as a friend when she was just a teenager, and then going on and making a name for herself in New York magazines, and doing this marvelous interview in this letter that was a piece of family history for her, and is just simply a piece of history for us. I like Louise very much. She died in the late 1960s, so I think about her life, and it spans, from being born probably in 1894 in St. Louis, Missouri, the Mark Twain era, World War II, being an editor for a major women's magazine in New York, and then living long enough to see us landing a human being on the moon in 1969. I don't think she lived quite long enough to see that, but it was we'd circled the moon by 1968. So quite impressive, and sometimes I think that my biography should be of Louise and not Albert. Kim doesn't think so. She thinks that I cannot be objective with Louise either, because I like her too much, and it would be a bit of hagiography. That would tend to turn Louise into a saint and demonize her father. I don't know. It might be a piece of... It might contribute to some fiction. At some point I might put Albert Bigelow Paine in a novel, using actually what I know of him and his character, which is, I have to say, he is a damned interesting character. And probably what makes me so uncomfortable about Albert Bigelow Paine is that I see some of myself in him. So, there you have it. That's the story of my research. So, if you're to take anything from this, it is this, I think. And that is, you never know where your research is going to lead you. You have to be open to non-academic sources of information. You have to be aware and pay attention. And sometimes you have to dig in the primary documents and use some detective work to get at what you're researching. Of course, this is not textual scholarship on my part. This is actual historical scholarship, which is second nature to an investigative reporter. And I can't help but think that there will be more to the story. All right, that's it. There you have it. Thanks for listening to what may have been a rather long-winded explanation of my research on Albert Bigelow Paine. I hope your research projects are going well. We are coming up on the end of the semester. If you're having any problems with them, please drop me a line. And again, I've said this several times, I do want to know what you're going to do for your research projects. So let me know. All right, thanks so much. See you. Bye.